Welcome to Building Better, the show where we iterate and improve on our lives, documenting the process along the way. Why is it so hard to just do the best thing sometimes? Procrastination is evidently pervasive, with some studies suggesting that up to 75% of people consider their own procrastination to be a problem or just ingrained into their personalities. Motivational talks and abstract information don't move the needle enough, so we're going to talk about how to start engineering our lives and environment to point us towards our goals. We'll start with why procrastination happens in the first place, move on to the three most common fixes and their individual pitfalls, have a brief aside on effective resting and reward systems, discuss different ways to set goals, including whether goal setting is useful at all, develop a practice for the pre-mortem, and learn how to execute a post-mortem. Nearly all of this is derived and synthesized from personal experience and documentation, so what works for one individual might not work for another. With that in mind, let's get started. Part 1. Procrastination. There can be any number of reasons why we delay our work, and while they're individual, it can be valuable to consider the primary reasons why it might be a chronic issue. Borrowing and adapting some language from programming paradigms, we'll be looking at three kinds of procrastination: procedural procrastination, functional procrastination, and reactive procrastination. Procedural programming is the default assumption when we talk about programming. It's about a series of functions that call each other, altering state, input, and output to produce some result. It's intuitive, which makes it a good analog for the most common form of procrastination, which we will be calling procedural procrastination. What we mean by procedural procrastination is the kind of resistance that comes when a project has so many prospective or unknown steps that taking the first one is paralyzing, or we perceive that we have to meet or exceed some arbitrarily fast pace for the project to be worth it. This is because our brains are constantly on the lookout for a good risk to reward ratio, but at the same time our brains are biased towards negativity when it comes to evaluating the future. One solution here can be found in the Rust language, more specifically the practice of compiler-driven development. Writing software with compiler-driven development is a constant back and forth between the modeled logic of an application and the code used to implement it. The model and the implementation push and pull off of each other through comparison and iteration until the program is finished. We can implement something similar in the real world with nearly any project. Our model will be the upcoming tasks, and our implementation will be the work that we actually do. We don't ever want to go more than 2 layers deep. Well, what does that mean? Since most projects require a specific sequence of steps, we never want to plan more than two of those ahead of our current state. This gives us just enough perspective to tailor our action towards the desired outcome, while reducing administrative overhead when we inevitably rewrite the list of things that we need to do. The point is that when we're climbing a mountain, the best and sometimes only thing we can do for ourselves is to focus on the next few steps. Functional programming is a paradigm where side effects like state or interaction with input and output are minimized, if not wholly prohibited. Information in this system is transformed through function composition rather than sequential actions and calls. If we were to find an analog in the real world, functional programming is akin to finding the perfect flow of deep work. So what causes bugs in functional programming, and therefore what causes functional procrastination to occur? Primarily, it's a lack of transparency and an abundance of complex abstraction. Very few things can be pure in the functional sense since the world is practical. Functional procrastination tends to come from perfectionism, where nothing gets done because theory is taking precedence over practice. So how do we get out of these kinds of ruts? Mostly by stepping back and running the tape through to the end. Running the tape is a practice where we consider our current course of action and what the immediate future looks like if we follow it. In the case of not starting a project because of an attachment to some perfect ideal, we can always ask ourselves the following questions. Can this work stay unfinished? Is the marginal improvement of perfect worth the delay to other important work? Is it better to have something fake that's flawless instead of something real that's flawed? In most cases, the answer to all three of these questions is no. As written in the Cult of Done manifesto, people without dirty hands are wrong, and this applies to all areas of life. Reactive programming is a paradigm where the data and logic are asynchronous and constantly updating. It's event-driven and common in web development. Where it applies to our understanding of procrastination is in getting stuck in feedback loops of stress, frustration, and self-criticism. Reactive procrastination for our purposes is not so much something that prevents us from getting started, but something that causes us to freeze up while working. It's essentially emotional overwhelm. The most effective method I found for overcoming reactive procrastination is to execute a brain dump. What's happening here is that our minds perceive everything we need to do as dependent on one another, and putting it all on a page or a text file or a canvas can bypass that overthinking circuit in our brain. Not to mention that a comprehensive brain dump can also identify any unfinished stress loops, which then we can complete via exercise, meditation, or creative expression to free up mental resources. What we want to look out for in the brain dumps are logical loops or rationalized tautologies that prevent us from acting. It's the kind of proverbial sword to the emotional Gordian knot that's causing us to procrastinate. Part 2: Motivation, Discipline, and Habits. Just like procrastination is fundamentally individual, there can be any number of reasons why we take actions that push us towards our goals. For our purposes, though, we're only going to talk about the big three of getting things done, collectively referred to as actuators for the time being. For this section, we'll be using some basic game terminology in the form of classes from simple RPGs like Cypher. More specifically, we'll be using the Warrior, Mage, and Rogue classes as our primary analogs. We can characterize motivation as the rogue of our actuators. The basic gameplay loop here is centered around focusing down individual targets or objectives. The rogue is usually only concerned with their next immediate goal and will stop at nothing to get it done, but lacks survivability once it's pinned down. Motivation as an actuator is much the same way, persistently occupying our thoughts until we feel as though we have no choice but to take action. In many ways, we use motivation to try to circumvent a lack of willpower. It's not enough that we want to do something, it's that we should want it so badly that we can effortlessly ignore incoming input and just get to work. The trouble, of course, is that we can't really control where it's pointing and how it'll react to external circumstances. Motivation can come from a lot of places, but generally there are only two that we actually care about, those being internal or external. Intrinsic motivation is concerned with how it feels to take action. It provides a sense of meaning when it's fulfilled, and sticking with game terminology, it can be leveled up by practices like intentional boredom, technological fasts in the morning or at night, and dopamine detoxes. It's easiest to find our intrinsic motivation when there's as little noise coming from the outside world as possible. And sometimes there might not be much intrinsic motivation, and that's just fine. Extrinsic motivation is concerned with what you gain after the action is completed. It provides a sense of satisfaction when it's fulfilled. Extrinsic motivation is closely tied to the reward circuitry of the brain, which we will talk about in more detail in part 3. For now, though, it's important to note that extrinsic motivation is like a fire, in that the brighter it burns, the quicker it runs out, and it will always need some kind of fuel to actually get going. It can actually be beneficial to divest from extrinsic motivation unless we really need the kind of temporary buff that it provides. Discipline is our mage class of the actuators. It adapts to and overcomes any external circumstances, lets us work through hardship, and keeps us hyper-focused on the task at hand. We can chalk discipline up to two basic principles, the first being the phrase by any means necessary, and the second being a held value that is worth whatever pain or suffering comes out of the first. As a culture, we tend to think of discipline as a personality trait rather than an emotional state, but in reality, discipline more closely resembles the latter than the former. It's an emergent state of mind that naturally arises with sufficient clarity of information and conviction. Note that sufficient is subjective here, and this is good since it lets us leverage some practices mentioned earlier, like brain dumps and compiler-driven development, to push our minds into a state of discipline. Clarity is just a sense of knowing what should be done next, and conviction is just the sense that the next thing is the best thing to do. We can build both clarity and conviction by focusing on the how and why of a project respectively. This is where practices like those in parts 4 through 6 are especially useful. Habits are a warrior class, characterized by a gameplay loop of repetition and defense. The reality of any habit is that they're not as much meant to make advancement than they are meant to maintain progress and prevent backsliding. How the habit is executed and the actions that those habits make room for are where actual progress is made. But the habit itself is more a matter of hygiene than anything. This doesn't mean that habits aren't useful. They're tank and support rolled into one. It's just that we can't expect to win a game off of habits alone. We can cultivate habits by integrating triggers into our lives or by implementing repetition in the form of rituals and routines. Habits are most effective when they're chained together, since that generally increases the chance that we're in the right headspace to get any work done, which increases performance and reduces any stress that comes from trying to force ourselves into the zone. Part 3: Rest and Reward. These will probably be the hardest practices to implement since they ask us to slow down or stop entirely, which are foreign concepts in the landscape of late stage capitalism, hustle culture, and grinding. Of course, there's nothing wrong with locking in to accomplish focused, valuable work, but there are many things wrong with demonizing or demeaning the very act of resting. How much rest do we need? The consensus is 42%, or in other words, 10 out of every 24 hours, including sleep. The clever among our audience may realize that roughly 8 hours of every 24-hour cycle should be spent in sleep, meaning that we only need to aggregate 2 hours of rest per day. There is some nuance here. Some research on human performance suggests that a work to rest ratio of roughly 3 to 1, with resting periods characterized by intentional detachment from the medium and placement of work being the most effective. This ratio strikes a general balance between allowing one to settle into an effective workflow and enforcing a long enough break to let the mind recover for the next cycle of work. It's important to note that people tend to cap out at 4 hours of high quality mental work per day, so longer breaks might be warranted. Reward can be pretty tricky to navigate. Research has shown that adding external rewards to activities that are intrinsically motivating can actually decrease motivation. But intrinsic motivation fluctuates from day to day, sometimes dropping down to nothing on particularly rough ones. We also know that doing or experiencing something difficult or effortful potentiates the perceived positive impact of a reward, which reduces even more stress than it otherwise would. The rule of thumb that we can operate on is to never reward activity that is typically intrinsically motivating and to rely on simpler, less dopaminergic rewards for those times when we really need them. We don't want to deprive ourselves out of a sense of duty or because we don't think we've earned it. That line of thinking is ultimately self destructive, so we ought to frame these rewards as bonuses, not base compensation or earning the right to enjoy life. Though it's important to note that excessive rewarding can actually dull our sensitivity in the long term. Chapter 4: Goal Setting. Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives contains the phrase journey before destination, framed in a book that documents the growth that a king undergoes as they travel their domain on foot. The phrase is about how accomplishment leaves no lasting impact on a person's character or virtue. Instead, it is the sum of their actions and choices made along the way to that accomplishment that actually defines them. It's essentially about learning to enjoy the process and to always do the right thing in the moment, which is a complicated thing to do, but it distinctly does not mean that the destination does not matter. Outcomes can't be performed, they instead aggregate from a series of actions, but unless we have an idea of what outcome we're looking for, we won't be able to properly contextualize the actions that we're taking. There are two models for goal setting that we'll discuss the pros and cons for today. The goal here is not to categorize all of our goals from here on out into one of these models, but to pick apart what works and what doesn't to create a flexible spectrum on which goals can be plotted. Nice goals come from Ali Abdaal's Feel Good Productivity, and it stands for Near Term, Input Based, Controllable, and Energizing. So, what do each of those mean? Well, near term just means that the span of this goal won't go much further than a week, or that it can be broken down into weekly milestones. The point here is to create a sense of not necessarily urgency, but to ensure that we're mindful of our time. Input based means that the goal is oriented towards the process, voicing the desired outcome in terms of behaviors that we want to implement. For example, grow a YouTube channel becomes make a video every 4 weeks. Controllable means that we want these behaviors to be reasonable and to fit into our lives with minimal friction. Of course, there will be times when our goals will push other parts of our lives out of focus temporarily, and that's okay, but we shouldn't be trying to overhaul our lives with every new project that we take on. And finally, energizing means that this goal should ultimately increase our subjective sense of autonomy, be fun to execute, and maybe bring us closer to the people around us. The pros of this model are that it's inherently sustainable and oriented towards improving our subjective experience of accomplishment. It's also agnostic to what domain of life we're setting the goal for, since all it cares about is the process. The cons are that this model doesn't really plan for difficulty or interruption. It essentially lacks specificity, assuming that we're already working from an outcome-based way of thinking. SMART goals have a few variants, but the version we're working with here comes from CGP Gray's 7 Ways to Maximize Misery. In this model, goals ought to be specific in scope, measurable to keep us on track, actionable to minimize procedural procrastination, and we need to be responsible for whether we put effort into the goal since we are time-bound by a deadline. Specificity and measurability go hand in hand, and we should be developing the phrasing of the goal by bouncing between these two tests like in compiler-driven development. We increase the specificity until it feels measurable, and we iterate on how it can be measured until we need to adjust the specificity, and so on and so forth until we have a concrete goal. Actionability and responsibility also go hand in hand, since the clarity and simplicity of the actions we take will drastically increase our perception that we can actually do them. If any part of the goal relies on waiting for something, then we should either discard that part or subdivide the goal so that the focus is always on what we can do. A goal being time-bound is not necessarily useful, especially if it takes the form of an arbitrary deadline. Some people just don't care for artificial, self-imposed limits, so we can take that last factor with a grain of salt. The pros of SMART goals include their focus, their orientation towards professional or intellectual work, and their ability to push on the actuators we talked about before. The cons are that they are particularly demanding and rely in part on some artificial, arbitrary external motivation, which can add friction for a lot of people. There are some common themes between nice and SMART goals, particularly in the domain of clear actions and feedback. If there's one thing we can take away from these models, it's that goals should be action-oriented. We cannot guarantee any particular outcome, we can only take a series of actions that we are reasonably certain will put us in a better position to encounter a better result. For the most part, though, outcome-oriented goals are only useful as compasses for our behavior. Part 5. Premortems. So, premortems started as a project management technique for groups, but they have incredible carryover into individual goals, projects, and pursuits. Premortems effectively turn the tendency to overthink and catastrophize into a weapon against passivity. Premortems work like this. Once we define a project and its goals, we do three things. 1. We capture all of our current thinking. 2. We think about where we could go wrong. And 3. We plan as if those missteps are inevitable. This process can effectively loop forever or until we feel reasonably satisfied in our solutions. Capturing our current thinking goes beyond just brainstorming. It's more akin to casting a wide net for resources, inspiration, tutorials, and examples. Nothing exists that hasn't been done before, and instead of letting ourselves be discouraged by this, we can instead capture what already exists and use it as fuel for our own thinking. This becomes drastically easier if we have something like a second brain to scan or search for any relevant information that we could put into use. The planning phase of a premortem is something like a pressure release valve for overthinking. To properly execute this phase, we first have to assume that we are going to fail. This is akin to running the tape through, but with a more speculative nature. We assume that we're going to fail or that we've already tried it and failed. Why? And how much of it were we responsible for? We need to go into this part of the process with a clear head. A big issue with catastrophizing is the implicit surrendering of responsibility. Assuming that everything will go wrong regardless of our actions is no different from assuming that everything will go right regardless of our actions. Instead, we want to focus on our behaviors, habits, and vices if they're even applicable to this scenario. We should plan with the assumption that we will be interrupted and that our willpower will fall short so that we can construct sequences and contingencies that don't rely on falling into deep work or having great motivation at that moment. Of course, we can never plan for everything, and that's okay. We just want to plan enough that we go into every work session clear on our intentions with the conviction that we can take care of any interruptions to our plans. Premortems aren't a permanent thing either. We'll likely need to revisit our premortems, and as new events come up, behaviors reveal themselves, and we run into blind spots that we missed the first time around. Part 6. Postmortems. Where premortems exist to clear our mind and prepare for the worst, postmortems exist to ensure that we don't develop any bad habits. Over the course of any project, we'll naturally feel pressure, which can cause us to get impulsive, which can cause us to develop stopgaps, half-measure solutions to immediate problems. Folding Ideas, the YouTube channel, voices this process as creating bespoke inefficiencies that will interlink and pile on until unraveling it becomes much too large to handle. We want to avoid that by using postmortems as retrospectives to unwind and dissect what pressures occurred, how we responded to those pressures, and what should be taken or discarded from our solutions. So what do we want to look at with postmortems? We want to compare our expectations with what actually happened. Of course, without regular documentation of the process, our postmortems will be mostly conjecture based on memory. So we'll want to be recording our thoughts throughout our working sessions. We can start with time. First of all, did we end when we thought we would? What's the discrepancy between how long it should have taken and how long it actually took? With that in mind, we can look for any notable distractions or interruptions, what areas of life had to take precedence, and why. How can we prevent these distractions and interruptions from becoming so time-consuming? What we don't really want to look at here are emergent tasks and demands that were part of the project. We can never account for everything, even in the best pre-mortem, so any additions to the project are accepted as par for the course. We can also get more granular with time, looking at what hours of the day felt the most productive. We exhaust our mental resources over the course of days, weeks, and months, and it could very well be that we work best from the morning until noon and then from the afternoon to the evening. Prescribed work cycles are ridiculous, so notice any judgment that might pop up and set it aside. After time, we can consider our subjective sense of energy and focus throughout the process. What actions are fatiguing versus energizing? What worked better with directed focus and what needed us to take a walk with our thoughts? This is all about building self-knowledge, which is a favorite on this channel, but also a great resource for our future projects. Postmortems build on each other over time, and as we write them, we can gradually close the gap between our expectations and our performance from both ends, which should hopefully be a motivating force in our lives, allowing us to make better choices. I've run out of time, so I hope that this information was useful to you, and I'll see you in the next release of Building Better.